Welcome to Fruity Knitting. This is episode 80. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Andrea.
We hope you're enjoying this summer and that it's not too hot for your knitting, no matter where you are in the world. We've got a very amazing knitter coming up in the show today. She knits many hours a day despite living in a very warm climate. She's only been knitting for around 7 years, but in that time she's knitted over 80 lace dresses. They're all her own design, based on lace doily patterns and sometimes lace shawl patterns.
Yeah, that's Tatiana Carr, who's our guest on Knitters of the World. And what she's doing with knitting really is amazing. It's original and very unusual, so you're going to totally love it. And then we have our feature interview with the Irish designer Carol Feller. And Carol has got so much of interest to say that we've split her interview up into 2 parts, and each part is like a mini knitting masterclass. So to give you an example, in part 1, Carol categorises the various types of gradient yarns that are available, and then she shows us how to use them best from a designing perspective. And then later in part 2, we really go deeply into short rows, and Carol compares 4 different short row methods and then shows us which method works best for different types of projects, which is fantastic. So she's been a knitwear designer now for over 12 years, and during this time she's really gained a lot of experience, both designing but also with teaching. So we know that you're going to learn a tremendous amount during this interview, which is exactly what we want and love.
Yep. We've also got a very short extreme knitting segment coming up. We're going to give you an update on our projects, and we're also announcing a new cowl.
Yes. We'll start with under construction and we'll look at my project first. It's the Saint Lunaire Griquet by Jennifer Bill, and this is the project that I'm doing, and it's very drapey.
Very drapey there.
Yeah. So I'm knitting this in the Nature's Luxury yarn On Stage Long Metrage, which is a blend of wool, silk and camel, and this really pretty spring colourway is called Legends of the Fall. So what I want to do first of all is show you a picture of the original design. So when I'm talking about modifications, you actually know what I'm talking about. So here it is here. It's knitted bottom up in the round with a basket weave eyelet pattern that's all over the body and the sleeves. And it has a really lovely panel of twisted stitch cables that runs up each side of the body as well as on the inside of the sleeves. And then you've got a stranded colourwork section on the yoke. And if you look closely at the yoke, you can see that it sits quite deeply. And it's sitting deeply because Jennifer has given the body quite a lot of positive ease. So it's got about 3 inches or 7.5 centimetres of positive ease. So last episode I spoke in quite a lot of detail about putting in body shaping because I like mine to be slightly more fitted. And here it is here. I've knitted right up to the armholes here, so that's the whole body part done, and you can see if we hold it straight that there is just a very gentle shaping going on here on both sides. So that's been successful. I didn't want to put my shaping in the sides with increases and decreases because I didn't want to interfere with this really beautiful twisted stitch cable panel that Jennifer has running down the sides. So I decided to do my shaping by changing needle size, which has the same effect in most cases. So I started off down here with 3mm needles, and then I decreased my needle size until I got to 2mm right around the waist. And I did that in 1/4 millimetre increments. So I started on 3mm, went down to 2.75, 2.5, 2.25, and then 2mm. And then I gradually increased my needle size back up again, but I only increased up to 2.75 because I want the bust slightly smaller than the hips. So that's worked. There it is. And what's been really good, which is not always the case, is that changing my needle size up and down hasn't optically interfered with the patterning. So the basket weave eyelet pattern here, you can't see that it's smaller around the waist than it is around the bust or the hips, which is cool. And the same goes for the twisted stitch cable pattern. If I hold it like this, hopefully you can see that. You can't really see that. I mean, there's a small difference here, but it's not, doesn't really stand out. So that's great. I've got away with it. The other thing I wanted to say is that when you're changing needle size, That'll affect the stitch gauge, which gives you, that's all right, you can knit now, thanks, which gives you the width of the garment, but it also changes the row gauge, which gives you the length. So I had to actually add on a couple of extra pattern repeats to give me the length that I wanted. But I'm very pleased it's worked out, and there it is. And I'm now on to the sleeves, and the sleeves I've done some modifications on too. So I'll show you again a picture of Jennifer's sleeves so you understand what I've done. Jennifer has made her sleeves quite loose fitting to match the loose fitting body of the garment, and you can see hers come down to just a little bit below the elbows, and the hem of the sleeve is actually the same width as the circumference of the upper arm. So because I've done my body more fitted, I do need to do something slightly different with my sleeves so that my sleeves will match my body. This is what I've done so far. This is a sleeve, and hopefully if I have enough yarn, and I think I do, I'm actually going to make my sleeves longer. So probably 5 centimeters longer than what Jennifer's done, and they'll come down to a true 3/4 length. And I've also decided to do mine more fitted, or at least the cuff is more fitted. And if you have a look here, if you can hold it with 2 hands like that, Jennifer has done the same pattern that's on the hem of the body, she's done on the sleeve cuff. You can see it there, which is really pretty. It's a gorgeous little pattern. And the first little modification I did was to make my sleeve cuff longer than what the pattern says. So it's actually the same length as the hem on the body. And I did that because I want my cuff to be very sort of stable and a little bit stronger. And that's because it's going to sit very narrow or snugly around my arm. So what I did, thanks. So what I did was just figure out the stitch count that I needed so that this would sit snug around my arm, and I knitted the pattern, and then in the last row of the cuff I increased up probably about 30 stitches till I got to the correct stitch count for the basket weave pattern and the twisted stitch cable pattern here. So the effect that it has is that it makes the sleeve look like a little blouse. I'll put it on and you can see. So there it is there. It's quite fitted here, and it's just gently blousy above it, which I think looks really good. And you can see that the inside of the sleeve is going to have the lovely twisted cable pattern here. So it's a very elegant design, and I'll probably do mine about that length, like that. So I'm really pleased with it. I think it looks very pretty.
Yep.
You like it too, don't you?
Yep.
It has been taking me a while to knit this. Like, I sit down and I knit a good chunk, and then I've actually only knitted this much, or a good chunk of time.
It does. That's always my experience.
Yeah. It's a little bit demoralizing, but it's yeah, but it really does. I feel like I've done a few hours on it and I'm only this much more. It's because I'm knitting on 2.75 millimeters. But hopefully by next episode, I will have finished both sleeves, and I will have joined them to the body, and I will have started the yoke, which brings me on to the yoke because I will be doing some slight modifications there as well. This is the colour that I've picked for my yoke. It's the same blend, or the same yarn. It's On Stage Long Metrage from Nature's Luxury, and the colour is Horse Whisperer. Now, I bought this from a photo online, and it's really hard to know exactly how dark a dark colour is from a photo because they always shine lights on it when they're taking photos of it, and I'm concerned that it's actually going to be too dark. If you can remember back to the original pattern, Jennifer uses a dark charcoal colour, and her main body and the contrasting pattern colour here is quite a light grey speckled yarn, but hers still looks very harmonious and balanced.
Yep.
And I'm concerned that mine's going to look too heavy, because if you remember that above the stranded colour work you've got quite a long section of stocking stitch, and I'm thinking this just might look too heavy. So I do have this colour here, which I think goes very prettily with the main body colour. It's also Nature's Luxury. Danica is the owner of Nature's Luxury, and we met Danica and her horse whispering husband, Philip, he's a horse trainer, about 2 years ago, and she gave me this skein as a gift. I think it works, it looks really pretty with this, and it's the same yarn weight, but it's a different blend. It's 65% silk and 35% camel. So I'm a little bit concerned that it's got no wool in it. If you remember back to our interview with Gillian Moreno, she talks about camel as being very similar to alpaca. It behaves very similar, but except for it's not quite as heavy and it has just a faint bit more elasticity, which is a good thing. So that's my hesitation with this yarn, is that I'm worried that it's going to behave in a different way from the other yarn. So what I've done is a swatch.
You're so good, Andrea.
I am good, aren't I? Well, you kind of have to. So there's my swatch, and I might even put a picture over Andrew so you can see up close. You can see that the dark colour really shows off the patterning very well. So I think in any other design that these two colours would work really well together. But I still think that if you can imagine that this tiny little section here of stocking stitch was a much larger section, it would be quite heavy. And that has kind of confirmed my feeling that it's too heavy. On the top, my concern, apart from it being a different blend, was that it's too light and you wouldn't see the patterning. But I do actually think that you can see the patterning enough. And it reminds me of Marie Wallen's designs, because you'll often find that she has intense patterns, but she uses colour tones that are closer together. So it still looks very harmonious and calming.
Yep.
So I think it might work that way. But the other thing I've noticed, you can see it probably here too, is see how wider, this is all done on the same needle gauge, and you can see how wider this yarn blend behaves than this one. So this one is sort of tighter and snugger, and this one's way looser. So I'm going to have to really play around with my needle size to make sure that I don't stuff up.
Yeah.
So that's this project, that's the update.
Yeah. Coming up now is part one of our interview with Carol Feller. You may know Carol from her wonderful knit-alongs, but even if you don't, I'm sure this interview is going to be a real treat.
Yeah. Welcome to Fruity Knitting. Joining me now is a well-known knitwear designer from Ireland. Many of you will know Carol Feller, who's based in Cork. Carol has been a full-time independent hand knit designer for 12 years now, which means that she's seen a lot of changes and is very experienced at adapting herself and her business in a very fast-changing industry. Carol regularly teaches at festivals and retreats. She's published several books, and 3 years ago, she brought out her own yarn called Nua. Carol has been on Fruity Knitting very briefly before when I did a very short interview with her during the 2018 Edinburgh Yarn Festival. She's a very clever lady with lots of interesting things to say, so I knew that I wanted to have her on the show again for a feature interview, and that has finally happened. So thank you so much, Carol, for agreeing to being on Fruity Knitting again.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Carol, could you fill out my introduction with just a brief summary of how you developed your skills and learnt your craft, and also mention any designers or authors who may have strongly influenced you during that process?
Oh yeah, certainly. I think, well, like most knitwear designers, very few of us actually set out to do knitwear design as a career. It's usually something you fall into accidentally, and you've often gathered, I think, a whole series of skills to start with that end up folding into one with that. In my case, when I left school, I couldn't really decide what I wanted to do because I really liked art, but I also liked maths and science. So to start with, I ended up for a year in art college, but missed very much the scientific end of things. So ended up going on to do structural design. And oddly enough, the two of those end up playing in together very much from a design point of view, because obviously, you know, you need some creative end where you really are interested in the creative side and you sit down and you can envision something. So without that to start with, I don't think you ever are going to have a desire to be a designer to begin with. But on the other side of it, because it's all based on numbers, because everything is about gauge and getting things to fit. So you need to know the gauge to actually have an understanding of numbers, and probably more importantly, even an enjoyment of playing with numbers and putting them into spreadsheets is an enormous advantage.
Definitely.
I mean, it can be done without that, but I think it really does help, I think. So they're like, those two are the initial two inputs, I suppose. And then as I've gone on in my career, I've moved from designing into teaching, which I think a lot of designers do end up start kind of morphing into teaching as well, because you just get asked to more and more festivals and things like that. And that's when I realized that other skills that I picked up along the way ended up coming into play, because I had, over my various different years of doing other things, one of the things that I did was I was a leche leader, which is basically a parent-to-parent breastfeeding support person. And we used lead meetings where we would facilitate and get we wouldn't so much give advice as we would lead discussions and just point people in the right direction and help when we could. And so I think from that, and actually being able to encourage and support people, meant that I was very comfortable talking in public, and more specifically kind of teaching, but very much in that case a parent-led, but in this case a knitter-led kind of way of teaching. So that's kind of, I suppose, the three main influences that came into play from my background to help me with designing and with teaching.
Yeah. Okay, now can you say something very quickly about Barbara Walker, because you said previously that she did influence you.
Barbara Walker would probably have been one of my influences when I started teaching, first of all, and when I started designing, first of all. And the reason for that is I think it really appealed to the structural engineering side of me, because she had a very structural approach to it. Specifically the book Knitting from the Top, because it's a very dense book with a lot of factual information in there, talking about different ways that you can construct things specifically from the top down. And that makes sense to me, because with knitwear, there is no reason to put it into pieces and seam it together, because with that, you're just trying to mimic sewn pieces where you're cutting your actual cloth out and you're seaming it together. But knitwear design is way more flexible than that. So Barbara Walker really appealed to me in the sense that she looked at it very differently. And kind of tied with that as well, Stephanie Chappell, who I would have come across first of all from Knitty magazine, the online magazine. And she used to do top-down construction. And that was the first time I tried top-down raglan construction. And I just found it absolutely fascinating, because until you actually sit down and do it, it doesn't make any sense. You're looking at it on the paper and you're like, I don't understand how this works. And then you get it on the needles and it's like a eureka moment. A bit like the first time you turn the heel of a sock as well, where it suddenly all comes together and you're like, oh, that makes sense. And so both of those really had an enormous influence in the way that I actually put my construction and my garments and my thinking of design together.
Well, you do use some really interesting and unusual constructions in your designs. So can you just, first of all, tell us a little bit about your design aesthetic, and then talk more about what you think your strengths are?
I think my design aesthetic, I was kind of to describe it as simple, but just one little bit of interest. Because generally speaking, when I'm trying to pull a design together, I'll have an initial idea and then you pare it back down so that so basically it's simplified so that you're keeping one interesting feature. And that way, I think that it means that it's got a lot more impact. But tied with that, when I'm actually writing a pattern, it's the construction and how it's put together and how the pattern's written is just as important as the actual design, so that the whole process for the knitter is interesting and fun, and it's not boring at any point. So like the first garment I've got here at this side this is Ravi. And it's probably a pretty good example of, I suppose, pared back design, because it's top down and it's side to side. So it starts at the yoke here going from side to side. And so the benefit of that is that you actually get a really nice fitting neck because you've got short rows to shape the top, and the bottom of it gets to be the size that it's supposed to be. But only the yoke is from side to side. From that point, you're going to pick up stitches and you knit it from that point down. And so that means that you can actually do shaping with the body, and you can also make the sleeves so that you can shape the sleeves. So each bit of it fits together so that it shapes the body very well, but it's never going to be boring. And when I started off, first of all, the actual lace feature I had in a few different places. And in the end, I just kind of cut them out and said, I actually think just the one lace is going to work much better. And you can't see it too well here, but the back of it has also got a curve where you're using short rows again to curve the back of it and to just create a nice visual interest without being too complex or just adding too much visual fussiness to it.
Yeah, I can see that there. I was going to ask you about that. And I think you're right. Just the lace panel across the yoke looks really, really elegant. And it's a very clever thing that you've done, is to put the waist shaping or the body shaping where it's easy in straight up and down knitting, and then just have the unusual construction around the yoke. That's great. So what else have you got? You've got another design behind you.
Here we've got another design, Tabbouleh, and this one is also got some kind of interesting construction going on. It's one that I've developed, because you actually find, I think as a knitwear designer, that you'll often end up developing your designs as you go through, where you start off where, in this case, it's going from the middle out of the back to each side. I started originally with, it was a design called Topo many years ago, and then this was developed further here, where you have a provisional cast on in the middle of just the shoulders, and it goes out from side to side on the back. And then from that point, you pick up stitches down the front and down the back. And if I turn her just ever so slightly, you can see what that means is the top of the shoulder, you've got your actual stitch pattern flow all the way down. And one of the techniques that I really love working with, as you know, I like short rows a lot. So the short rows end up getting thrown in everywhere. And I've got short rows back and forth to shape the actual top of the sleeve as well. So it's got lots of kind of fun techniques all built into the pattern, and it's all top down.
Wow. Well, we're gonna definitely get on to short rows later. And do you have a third design that you can just quickly show us?
This design here is Chimera, and it's a little bit similar to the Tabbouleh that I was showing you here. What we have, it starts with a central back panel, so it's just one big long strip knit. But then from that point, what you're doing is you're picking up stitches just for the yoke, and you're knitting it all the way out here with the sleeve down. And you've got the shaping actually on each side of the panel, and then you do the same on the top. So at that point, you end up with it's like a little bolero. You've got the two sleeves and you've got the central panel. And then you just pick up the body and you're working it down. And because these stitches are live here, you actually get to work that central panel so it continues down. So you can kind of probably see that's often something I tried to build into things, where you've got a stitch pattern where even though the other pieces around it are built separately, where if you put the stitches on hold, you can then build it back into the rest of it. So it's a little bit like putting building blocks together, but trying to make it look like it flows continuously. I think that's actually quite important for me in designs, is making things look seamless, even if they're not always seamless.
Okay, and what I noticed with that design is you've used variegated yarn, and that also shows the direction of the knitting very well. And I think that's a really clever way of using the yarn with the pattern.
Yeah, because you can often then also, with different you can even do something that's more variegated. And because you've got it moving in different directions, it gives you a lot more ability to blend big variations in yarn. So you could have a darker color for the upper section. And then if you've got a totally different skein color, you could actually even do it for the other one. Same with Ravi, where I've seen when you've got the yoke done around like this, I've seen wild colors, but with short rows, they actually end up looking fantastic.
Which this is going to lead me on to to my next question, because in 2016 you self-published a book called Knitting with Rainbows, and that book included 11 patterns where you were showcasing gradient yarns to their best advantage. And I think gradient yarns are really interesting because they're similar to speckled yarns. When speckled yarns first came out, most people were just knitting them in plain stocking stitch, which I think sort of gets a little bit limiting aesthetically after a while. But then gradually, designers started using them more and more creatively, and that got super exciting. So, but I'm sure there's a lot of challenges with designing with gradient yarn. So can you talk about some of those challenges? But first of all, just say what types of gradient yarns there are.
Yeah, with gradients, very often the most difficult part is trying to figure out what to do with them, because frequently people will buy these gradients because in the box or in the collection, they just look incredible. But the problem is that what you see on the skein doesn't always translate into the finished piece. And so like what started this whole process off for me was I had a really nice looking gradient that I got. It was from Fiber Optics. And it was in this little box and it sat there and I didn't know what to do with it. And then I gathered other ones and I realized that there was huge big variations in the type of gradients. And so I wanted to classify them, and maybe I should be the scientist. But I wanted to classify them and put them into different categories so that it allowed me to figure out the best way of using them. So I did that in a general way in the book, and then put different stitch patterns and different design ideas for each one of those together. So the first one that I looked at is this type of yarn, where you can actually see it's a single skein of yarn and it goes from one color, in this case the light color, all the way to the darker one. This is Freya. And this is probably the easiest one to use because you can pretty much use this in any pattern. Biggest problem is going to be that it's just a single size. So it's quite difficult to extend it because you have to kind of intersperse it. Sometimes what people end up doing, and I find quite good, is single skein like this and taking a complementary or maybe a very big contrast color, and you can intersperse it and then the gradient continue on behind it. So the example I have here is Shanakeel, and this is knit in Knit Circus yarn. And it starts with very, very light purple and it runs all the way to this bright gold over on the other end. And because this was quite a long, a big skein of yarn, I should say, I was able to use the one skein to do the whole thing. So I could pull the end of the skein, in this case, the goldy color, and use it as the contrasting color going through here. So I'm working from the start and the end of the skein together. And another thing that I was doing with this that I find great with gradient yarns is because you've got the color change going this way, if you pull in biasing effects, it means that you have your color going one way, but the pattern going another way. So I'll see if I can pull it out a little bit here. So you can kind of see.
That's exciting.
Yeah, so it means that, so adding a little bit of visual interest and finding a way of extending that single skein of yarn, I think is the challenge with one skein like this.
That's really beautiful. I love the colour combination. Can you just hold it out for me one more time, the scarf, so we can all see it?
Here's the scarf kind of held out and the tip is up on my right side here and the end of it, the cast off, is over on this side here, and that's Shanakeel.
It's completely stunning. Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so what else?
So that is the first one. The next type that you're kind of looking at then, you're looking at multiple skeins of yarn like this. They're a little bit mixed up the colors. So normally you'll have it go from one side to another, going from light to dark. This particular sample here, you can see they're very close together. So you can almost use this a bit like that single scale gradient, where you can run straight from one to another and you're going to get hardly any color difference in between the whole thing. But one thing that you can do with these little mini skeins as well is you can have a couple of them. If you manage to get 2 or 3 packs of these, you can use all the small one, all the next one, and so that you can end up with a much bigger variant of skeins then.
Because that would be a problem with garments, wouldn't it? You need to have enough of the yarns that smoothly run in, enough quantity to knit a proper big garment.
Exactly, and that's definitely the challenge of using gradients for bigger projects. Is that's one of the things you need to think about, is how to pull it in. So like the example I have got here is called Mardyke. And so that goes, you can see it goes from a yellow color over here all the way to the dark brown. And that was a whole series of little mini skeins. And in this case, I actually just joined them together. And again, like the last time, you can see that I've used biasing, where you've got increases on one side and decreases on another. So the entire thing is slanting as you're going through then. So that means that you've got, you basically color going one way and the pattern going the other way. What you've got as well is the waves in the stitch pattern also just basically break up your actual, I suppose, the color, so that you're not getting just straight lines going across.
I was wondering if you'd done any slip stitches there on the colour changes, but you haven't?
This one, it's not slip stitches. It's drop stitches. So it's actually, I've just got a drop stitch. And so, you're winding the yarn around it twice, and then you drop it off in the next row. So you get this lovely big extended stitch pattern. And what that actually, I find that does is, because you've got these increases and decreases going across here, then this drop stitch, even though it's just going straight across, the increases and decreases on each side of it cause it to undulate up and down. So I think often with gradients, what you're trying to do is you want to break it up. It's like you bias, you want the stitch patterns, you're looking for undulating stitch patterns, laces with increases and decreases and things like that. So it means that you get a lot more visual interest, and it's not just rows of color changing, which, while it is interesting, I think that there's a lot more can be done with gradients than that. So the third type that I want to look at is similar to the last one, because it's a series of different little skeins, but this time, instead of having ones that are really close together, you're having big color jumps. So they're really more like complementary colors, more so than gradients that can be moved into gradients. So here, these are just 3 colors where you can see they're not exactly this, they're moving from a light to a dark color.
There's a big step in between each, yeah.
Yeah, but because of the jumps, what you want to do is a way of dividing it up. So the first one here that I've done is, I'm going to put these on, these are Probies. And these ones, it was a set of mini skeins, but it actually had, but because there was big jumps between the colors, what I ended up using was a slip stitch pattern to actually pull one color up to the other color. And it really helped to kind of, to kind of spread the colors between the two of them. So I find slip stitch patterns, which is one of the sections I ended up putting in the book, are fantastic for colors where you want big contrast. It's not going to work for ones with very low contrast, but for big contrast, it's fantastic. The other way I've done it is with this shawl here, which is the Half Moon shawl. And the Half Moon, the colors I was showing you a while ago, you can see here, they go from the light blue all the way up to the purple. And what I've done with this is I'm using a complementary color to divide. So every time you're going from one color up to the next color, you've got a complementary color going through. And so what that means is you're creating a natural divide, and it actually then allows you to very much extend the amount of colours you're doing. So you can add in extra of these ones and then put your contrast colour, and then you move on to the next one and you've got your contrast colour, and you end off with the final colour. So it's a really good way of extending the colours out a little bit further.
Hello again. I've just done a big mistake, so I have to backtrack a whole lot, which is kind of annoying. Hope you enjoyed part 1 of the interview. In part 2, Carol is going to answer all the questions you have on short rows and short row methods, even the questions that you didn't realise that you had. Because in 2015, she published this book here, which is Short Row Knits. It's really like a master workshop on short row methods. It compares all the different ones and gives you a lot of beautiful projects to practice them on. So a lot of that information she's going to be talking about in part 2 of the interview, and she also shows us her yarn, which reminds me that she's offering Fruity Knitting patrons a 15% discount off both her yarns and her books from her online shop on her website. And Carol has 2 types of yarns, Nua, which is a sport weight, and Nua worsted, which is obviously a worsted weight yarn. And Carol is also offering a 25% discount off her self-published patterns from her Ravelry store, which you've seen are really stunning. They're well designed and very well written. And I think this is a really great offer. And Carol has published some beautiful collections in book form, both digital and print. And her Short Rows book that I've just showed you is a really great book to have in the technical part of your knitting library.
I've completed my Muracal by Olga Buraya-Kafelian, who also works under the name Olga Jazzy. I mentioned in the last episode that the inspiration for this design is the Murafold, which was developed by the Japanese astrophysicist Kyoto Miura. Now, I found that really interesting, but it was actually only after I'd been knitting on this cowl for a while that I recognized that the design of the cowl doesn't quite match the design of the Murafold, and I'll show you why that is. So here's a diagram of Olga's design, and you can see that it's essentially a whole lot of parallelograms stacked on top of each other. The Murafold, on the other hand, has to have the parallelograms mirrored on each repeat. So once you know that, it's really easy to, or it would be really easy to modify Olga's design to match a real Murafold. Obviously that's not important, but I still found it interesting. And I looked into it, and the reason the Murafold is so brilliant is that it allows you to fold up rigid panels into a very small space and then unfold this structure in a very, very well-defined way, okay? And Kyoto Miura is an astrophysicist, and the application that he found for this was for solar panels on a satellite. So they've actually done this, and this is my little model to show you how it works, all right? So if you imagine this is our solar panel, and we're sending it up into space on our satellite, and so we want it as small as possible, and you can see it folds up really small. So we send it up into space, and I need to grab it at the right spot. And once we're into orbit, we've got our satellite in orbit, then you can unfold this structure in a really orderly way. So you simply pull this way, and this is what they do out in space, and the thing stretches out. I've grabbed it at the wrong spot. There it is, and it stretches out into the big solar panel structure. And the thing is that the path that takes is really well defined. Doesn't quite work perfectly with paper, but still. Now, that's really...
So it's defined because all of these little bits are very rigid.
Yeah,
right?
Because they're rigid, but also because it's not just a plain crisscross square pattern. Okay, because they are parallelograms and they have these angles, there's kind of only one way it can go. Right? So if you imagine you had something like this, but instead of having this sort of zigzag pattern, it was just all right angles, so a whole lot of squares instead of parallelograms, then the thing could essentially, it could sort of hang down, or it could go in different ways, particularly when you were squashing it up again. When you squash it up here, it goes back together in a defined way. Whereas if it was just a crisscross squares, you could easily... It won't actually work.
You mean like it could flop out in the centre?
Yeah, it could flop and not go together properly. So but your knitting's not rigid.
Yeah.
So it's not really that important. It does look a bit different if you change the pattern, and I actually think if you just change it the basic way, it doesn't look that good. You essentially end up with this zigzag, which is a different pattern, and maybe you like that, but I don't know that it's any better than the design by Olga. You could also offset it a bit, and then you end up with mirrored parallelograms, but still having a checkerboard sort of thing. So it's like, I've got another diagram of that. Here's the other diagram of it. So I'll just show you the other little model that I made. That's another one. The angle's all different on this, so it doesn't do the same thing, or you can't see it, but still there it is. It looks really cute.
So you could just squish it all up.
Yeah, and they're looking at medical applications for this sort of thing, where you need to make something really small, but it's still got certain physical properties. So It's pretty cool. But I think essentially the main benefit of changing it, modifying Olga's pattern so that it does reflect a real mirror fold, is you can then tell the story, and you haven't got the risk of somebody saying, hey, your cowl here, actually it doesn't look like the solar panels on that satellite up there. And you don't want to underestimate the risk of having an astrophysicist amongst your knitting friends.
That's true. Jennifer Bill is actually a weather scientist.
She's a weather scientist, so
she might know.
Yeah, she's probably working on data from a satellite which has solar panels which look almost like this cowl.
It's a small world.
It's a small world, yes. All right. So that's my cowl, my finished project. My new project is, I said in the last episode, I had the suspicion that Andrea was going to give me something a little bit more challenging, and I was completely right. Andrea being the master and I'm the apprentice. I'm going to be doing a classic cable cardigan for our daughter Madeline. And we've looked long and hard at lots of different designs. And we ended up deciding, or we finalized on this design by Michelle Wang, and it's called Celine. What we thought was really cool about this is the way you've got the cables and they sort of end up being a bit of a diagonal pattern there. And we like the way that sort of contrasts with the very deep V neck on the cardigan. Yeah, so it's a Brooklyn tweed design.
Yeah.
We're still waiting for my wool to come, so I haven't got that yet. I have got a small amount of the wool, so I'm going to be doing a swatch to check that out.
Yeah.
And in the meantime...
And to practice your cables.
That's right, I'm going to practice cables.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'm also working on this sock with incredibly fine yarn. Microscopic.
Another sock for me.
Yes, that's right.
So this leads on to starting a new caul. We've just finished our Martin Story caul. We've still got the Woolly Wormhead caul, which goes to the end of July, and we've got a year-long crochet along happening. But we really do need a new caul. Now, in the past, I've always easily come up with new ideas for a caul, but it took me a little bit longer this time. We've had some really great themes in the past. We've had... What have we had? We've had Modify Your Garment caul, where you had to do a major modification on a garment. We've had the first
garment caul.
First garment for people who have never done sweaters before. We've done the Knit for Your Man caul, so any dear man in your life gets a jumper. So that could be your partner or your son or your brother. So that was a really fun one. Yep. I really enjoyed that one. We've had the You and Me caul, where you had to knit two projects, big projects, one for yourself and one for a dear friend or person of your choice. And the projects had to be connected, so they could have been the same yarn, the same pattern, or the same patterning, or something that connects them in a story.
Yep.
So you remember each other. We've had the Lace and Cables caul, so we've had quite a few good cauls, but we've got a new caul. What I wanted is something general, so a lot of people could participate, but something very challenging. So I've come up with the New Technique caul. Now, the rules for the New Technique caul: it has to be a large project. It can be a jumper or a cardigan for an adult, or a large shawl, or a large blanket. And you have to take a technique that's scary for you. You might have done it a little bit, but it's kind of on the edge of your comfort zone, and you think, I don't know, I didn't succeed very well with it, or it looks too hard, or I'd really like to do it, but never got around to doing it. So something that's scary, a new technique for you. So for Andrew, for instance, he's done a little bit of cabling. He did that little squiggle on my hiking jacket.
The squiggle cable, that was good.
But his new cardigan is just covered with cables, so he's going to get a ton of practice. And the reason why it has to be a large project is we want you to get a ton of practice. We want you to be doing this technique hundreds of times, so that by the end of the project, you actually have some familiarity, some real familiarity with it, and you've got it in the muscle memory. Because if you only do it for one small section, it's so new that even when you finish that small section, you haven't become accustomed to it. So it's really not a point. It's not going to benefit you. You'll still be scared about it next time you come to it. So you have to pick a project. It doesn't have, for instance, if you're doing cables for the first time, it doesn't have to be really tricky. It can be a simple cable, but you're going to repeat it for the majority of the project. So that's the guidelines. The majority, or a large portion of the project, has to be repeating this new technique. If you've never done short rows, for instance, don't pick a garment that just has 4 short rows on the shoulder shaping. That's not enough. Pick a large shawl that the whole structure of the shawl is to do with short row shaping, so that you've practiced short rows 100 times and you really feel familiar with it at the end. So we want you to pick a technique that's scary for you. So it's a big challenge, and that you can really at the end say, I've achieved that. I've become familiar with it, and it's now in my box or my toolkit.
I think it should be called the Scary Cal.
Yeah. Well, see, Andrew and I always have disagreements about names, because he likes short names that are exactly to the point, and I like descriptive names which take a few extra words. So I think maybe the Scary Technique Cal. Or the new Scary Technique Cal.
The new Scary Technique Cal.
Anyway, so that's the guidelines. Now, Emmy, who is Tathbia on Ravelry, has very kindly been doing most of the moderating in our Carl Ravelry threads, which has been absolutely wonderful. Now, it is really hard to tell somebody that your project doesn't fit the guidelines, so you can't be involved. So make sure that you're pretty strict on yourself with the guidelines, so that poor Emmy doesn't have to feel bad about telling you that your project can't be included.
Yeah.
And take it as a challenge, take it as an opportunity to do that thing that you're scared about. So you want to jump in the deep end with 2 feet. It's going to be exciting. We'll all be in there together. What?
Yep. Well, I'm scared.
Are you?
Yeah.
Are you really?
Totally.
Being scared is good.
Yep.
Hello, my name is Tatiana Kar. I'm from Kazakhstan and I speak Russian. I've been living in the United States for quite some time now. I've been a passionate knitter for 7 years now when a friend introduced it to me. I've always been fascinated by doilies and shawls because of their beauty and the complexity of their motifs. It never made sense to me to knit something so intricate and just to be put away in a closet. That's where the idea came from, that I would want to knit doilies and shawls and make something wearable out of them, such as tops, skirts, and especially dresses. I've knitted over 80 dresses for myself, and I've donated some for a donation or a charity to be sold for a higher price, given that I've invested a colossal amount of hours in each project, ranging from 100 hours up to 300 hours. So let me show you some of my work. This dress is made out of lace weight yarn in mohair and silk blend by Cascadian Yarn. It was knitted from waist down and waist up. It is a converted doily called Freya, and the design is very simple with nothing special. There's nothing special about it. However, the intention behind it is to rather show the beauty of the motifs themselves. When I was knitting the skirt, after second repetition, there is a particular row that doubles the amount of stitches. In order to avoid that, it could be easily modified to end up with the same amount of stitches. When I've finished knitting the skirt, I simply used the crochet hook to insert the elastic and then picked up stitches and knit everything from waist up. The motifs were borrowed from the skirt where diamonds appear and applied to the top. A few words about the slips. Right now, I'm wearing a nude color slip, but I do have several colors that I can wear with the same dress that transform the look of the dress and can be easily matched to your shoes or purse. And this is how it looks. Now I would like to show you another interpretation of Freya doily. I was planning on exposing this dress to outside harsh elements such as sun, rocks, grass, and sand. And that's why I chose Artiste acrylic crochet thread number 5. And this acrylic yarn is known for stain resistant characteristics. This yarn is much bulkier than my previous dress, therefore it transformed the look of the dress. I used less repetition in rounds, which creates a more fitted look around my hips, and the top is knitted in all stockinette stitch all over. The embellished touch here is a sew-on beaded collar, and a few words on a slip again, since I'm wearing nude colors, which is not very contrasting color to my skirt. The motifs are closed in and therefore dress looks much heavier. However, if you want to lighten up the dress and make it more weightless, you might want to consider a much contrasting slip. In this dress, I used doily called Romantic by an unknown designer. Because this doily was so long, but I still wanted to preserve the entire story of the doily, I had to use 00 size needles, and I still ended up with a maxi dress. I also used yarn that is called Silk Indian 20/2. It's 100% silk. And what's interesting about this particular garment is that I use this as a coloring book. As you can see, some of my motifs are highlighted with a gray color. The way I did that, I spread my garment out on a table that was covered by foil, or the plastic would work too. I didn't want to put any fabric behind it because when I was coloring my garment, I didn't want that fabric to soak up dye and travel in the areas that I didn't want staining the garment. I also used jasquid acid as my agent, and also I used rubbing alcohol. I was applying the rubbing alcohol with a spray bottle in the areas that I wanted to color. I made sure that my brush, the regular brush, like a watercolor brush, when I was coloring, I made sure that I didn't touch anything that is close to the edge, for example here, so the dye wouldn't travel. However, the good news that the yarn overs around the motifs naturally preventing the dye travel too far. So, and this is the final results of this coloring. In this example, I used doily called Eichenlaub, which means acorn in German language, by Herbert Niblin. The yarn was used as 100% merino wool in lace weight by Jagaspon. I would like to talk about 3 features on this dress. First one, as you can see, the skirt sits higher than the natural waist, about 5 inches. That's just to give you another idea what to do when you're dealing with longer doilies in order to achieve shorter skirt length. And some of my dresses actually sits up to my arm suit, and later I was just decided I'm going to wear a belt. And the second feature on this dress is, instead of using the motif borrowed from the skirt, I used texture from the acorn and applied it all over the top. And the third feature is a ruffle that goes all around my collar. So instead of isolating a specific motif, I rather kneaded the entire section of the skirt and applied it here. And what's interesting about this collar, that I've inserted the elastic, which allows me to rearrange my collar in a different way, depending on the mood. And for example, like this. So let me show you how it looks all around. If you're inspired and you want to make your very own doily dress, consider the size of the doily. If it's too long, even for a maxi dress, then you might want to sacrifice some of the motifs and start knitting at the later rows on the doily. Or you can stop knitting early and come up with your own edging. If none of those options are feasible for your project, then consider smaller needles and a lighter sized yarn, which will create a tighter and a smaller fabric. Finally, if you are one of those people who have numerous amount of doilies sitting in your closet and you want to show it off to your friends, you just might have a ready-made dress sitting on your hands. What you need to do is to cut out the centerpiece by securing all the stitches first, either through the lifeline or using sewing machine. Thus, a donut-shaped doily now becomes an instant skirt or a ready-made dress, like a basis for your dress. I hope you found this useful and happy knitting!
Isn't Tatiana amazing? Her knitting is just so gorgeous.
Yeah.
I totally love discovering or seeing new knitters who are thinking outside of the box and doing something different and unusual with their knitting.
Yep.
And she fits in that category, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just beautiful, beautiful dresses. So well done, Tatiana, and thank you so much for your contribution. It's great. Actually, that's the perfect wedding dress, isn't it? You could just make the most stunning wedding dress. Madeline's got to get married. There's not a guy on the horizon yet, so
Yeah.
that's a long way off. It reminds me of the interview that we did in episode 64 with the two Shetland sisters, Anne Janssen and Kathleen Anderson. They knit absolutely stunning, gorgeous, intricate Shetland lace sort of heirloom shawls. And it's just beautiful, their work. And ever since interviewing them, I thought I would really love to plan out an heirloom shawl with different Shetland lace patterns and knit it. But what's kind of held me back is the fact that I just wouldn't wear it. And I really love wearing my knitting. I would actually get more wear out of a lace dress. And actually, I should just email them quickly and get them to watch
Check it
Tatiana,
out.
because they would love that.
Yeah, yeah.
They would find what she's doing really great.
Yeah.
So I had to do that. But so a dress is closer, but I still don't think I'd get that much wear out of it, which is a shame. When I used to perform, I would definitely get wear out of it, because that was always a great excuse for buying gorgeous clothes, because
And dressing up.
Yeah, I had to really dress up then. But now I just work from home and we don't go out much.
Yeah. Nobody ever sees you.
I can't sit at home editing in a beautiful lace dress.
No. You could sit here.
Yeah, but then you'd only see me waist up. You wouldn't see. There's so much knitting in that skirt. Did you see it? It's just stunning. Anyway, so Madeline has to get dressed up or live a glamorous lifestyle, which also doesn't look like it's going to happen. She gets dressed up less than me, or she has to get married.
Yeah.
Something will happen.
Yeah. The only thing is, maybe you should start now anyway, because there's probably a bit of work in one of those, either a shawl or a dress. There's a bit of knitting in there.
I don't think you should be doing anything for a couple of years, Dales.
Yeah.
So we're now up to the part where we ask you to support the show and become a patron. Just to remind you, this is my full-time job, and at the end of July, it's also going to be Andrew's full-time job.
Yep.
So for the last 3 years, I've been working on this full-time, 7 days a week for the last 3 years, and Andrew's been working every evening and weekend on top of a full-time demanding job. So as you can imagine, we couldn't keep this up longer than 3 years. It was way too stressful and we were heading for a breakdown. So we actually had to make a really hard decision. Do we stop the show, or does Andrew leave the security of his job and we go to both working full-time and have a couple of evenings off during the week and even one day off during the week, and therefore make it more sustainable to go into the future? Well, we made that decision. It was a very tough decision. It was hard for us. But just to remind you, we put all of our energy into making a high-quality production. So we're not earning an income from anything that's related on the side, and we don't sell anything else, and we're not receiving advertising or sponsorship money. The show is only possible through patron support. You can become a patron for a small amount each month, and your contribution does really make a difference. So if you are watching, please do become a patron. And for all of the wonderful viewers who have taken action to support the show and make it possible, a huge thank you, because it really is your show. It wouldn't exist without you. So thank you.
Yep. Coming up now is a very short and sweet extreme knitting segment. We took this footage when we were in Wales over Christmas, and it's a place called Fairy Glen. It's a beautiful little gorge, and we've actually got some really beautiful Bach prelude. It's prelude number 9 in E-flat minor. So enjoy that. Straight after that, we've got part 2 of our interview with Carol Feller, where you're going to learn all sorts of amazing things about short rows, also very valuable. So thanks very much for being with us today. It's been fun for us. Hope it's been good for you. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Bye.
Bye.
So in 2017, you brought out your own yarn range, which you've called Nua. So just tell us briefly what motivated you to do that. Also tell us what the name means. And more importantly, or to me, tell us what yarn characteristics that you were really excited about including in the yarn when you were designing it.
Yeah, in 2016, I believe, or 17, I keep losing track of years because time moves on far too quickly. I brought out the first yarn, which was Nua, which is this one here, which is a sports weight yarn. And then this year, I brought out Nua Worsted, which is a worsted weight yarn. So I was really excited about actually putting a yarn together myself for a couple of reasons. The first one is that because I primarily design garments, I wanted a yarn that worked really well with garments. And of course, as a designer, normally you get color ranges from yarn companies, and you can go like, oh, I'd like that color if it could be just slightly in this end of the range. But it meant that I had complete control over the colors that I got to put together. So there's something really kind of a little bit exciting about being able to do that, because it's not often you have that degree of control. So the way it ended up putting together is all of us really played to our strengths, because I knew what I wanted to design with. And because I wanted to design with garments, or primarily garments, I wanted one that was non-superwash. Because with superwash, because of the actual coating on it for garments, it gets a little bit heavy, and so it doesn't always hold its shape. So that was why the non-superwash was important to me. Then the actual blend of fibers, it was 60% merino, 20% yak, and 20% linen. And that idea actually came from Andy, who was the person who organizes the milling, because he knows his fibers, and they all play really nicely together, because the merino, the advantage of the merino is that it's just a good workhorse yarn. It's soft and it's fairly cost effective. Yak has got two benefits. One, it's pretty much as soft as cashmere, but in addition to that, it's got this very light beige color naturally. And what that does is it totally changes the actual way everything dyes, because when you're over dyeing on a beige yarn, it means everything has got a slightly rustic, muted tone. And then the last one is linen. Linen it's kind of a nod to the fact that there was a very strong linen tradition in Ireland historically up in Belfast. And it has the added benefit in the yarn. It's got a totally different fibre. So when it's dyed, instead of going the darker colours, it stays a light tweedy effect. So you can particularly see it in the darker colours. That deeper depth of colour and tweedy effect comes from the linen and the fact that it does not dye the same way as the other colours. So that's kind of how all of those fit together. One of the kind of interesting things for us was, I don't like naming things, but my husband loves naming stuff. So most of the names came courtesy of him, in that he went ahead and I tell him what I was thinking about. I'm like, this reminds me of, I don't know, a cat or something else. And then he would keep throwing names at me until one stuck. And I said, oh, that's the one we want. That sounds good. So it's kind of playing to strengths. He likes naming stuff, and I know when he hits on a name that I really like the sound of.
So is Nua an Irish word?
Nua is an Irish word. It means new in Irish. So I often feel a little bit silly when I'm saying he's my new yarn Nua, because it's a little redundant.
Yeah, especially down in Cork, because it's a heavy Irish-speaking area of Ireland, isn't it?
Parts of it, yeah, and the West, yeah.
Okay, so I'd really like to get back onto short rows, which you mentioned earlier. You've got a really comprehensive book called Short Row Knits, and in the book you describe 4 different methods of short rows, and there's plenty of patterns in here for the knitter to get lots of experience and practice in doing short rows in different areas of knitting. For example, bust darts or set in sleeves or dipping hems and neck shaping. Now, personally, I just really love the German short row, and I'm never really happy with the wrap and turn method. I always find it looks just a little bit sloppy, and I often wonder why we can't just ditch that method altogether and just simply have German short rows, or on occasion, if we want a really sort of invisible finish, perhaps a Japanese short row. So can you just give us a description of which short row methods work best in different areas of knitting?
So short rows, very often when you're looking at short rows, people don't realize what they are because they think that they're much more complicated than they are in reality. So with short rows, all you're doing is you're going shorter than the end of the row, then you're turning and you're working back to go in the other direction. So it's how you actually join that gap is what makes the difference. And you want a method of turning so that you hide that gap. The reason there are so many methods out there is because different techniques work better for different types of situations. So the one that most people have encountered is going to be the wrap and turn method. And very often it's ended up used as shorthand in most patterns. They just put in wrap and turn. The technique that I have actually done with wrap and turn is I've made sure that the actual wrap sits behind the stitch, because that's often what messes up short rows. Because if the stitch doesn't stay straight, it's going to be very obvious where you turn. It works well in stitch patterns where you've got a fairly good gauge. It's not too loose and it's not too tight. And in situations where you might have a lot of short rows, because it's easy to spot where it is because you can see the wrap. So the first example I have of wrap and turn is Salto, which is this pattern here. And it's used both across the top of the shoulders where you've got the shoulder slope. And so I've used short rows to actually to slope instead of doing stair steps. And also across the actual the top of the sleeve cap again, because I find short rows one of the best ways of actually putting in a sleeve cap, because you've got the opening and you just pick up all the stitches, and then you start with about the top third and you add one extra stitch each time. And wrap and turn for that particular one is extremely advantageous because you can leave the actual wrap there and it forms an actual seam line down the side of the sleeve. So it means that wrap and turn is the fastest to do, and it actually enhances the sleeve cap.
I might have to rethink my ideas on wrap and turn.
So the next short row technique that I want to look at is the Japanese short row, which is really almost like an extension of the wrap and turn, but instead of actually wrapping that yarn around the stitch, you're putting it on a stitch marker or a piece of yarn or a safety pin. And the benefit of this is because you're putting it on something off and not trying to wrap it around the stitch, it's much smaller. And then because it's much smaller, you can use it in situations that the wrap and turn will be too visible. So I would use it on, if you've got a very loose gauge, like a lace weight, it's great for that because the fabric can be quite see-through. In the one behind me here, which is Esterella, I've used it for the bust shaping because, again, it's going to be really obvious. And in this case, it's a slightly chunky yarn. So even a small bit of extra yarn is going to be really obvious. So yeah, for the short row method for Japanese short rows, I find that really, really handy for places where you want it invisible. So that's number 2. The third one would be German short rows, which is your favorite, I believe, correct?
Yes.
And that was one that I actually picked up by accident through the Ravi knit along, because I hadn't come across it. And there was a particular lady who said, why don't you use German short rows? And I hadn't come across them before. And so when I looked into them, like, they're a great short row method, particularly for garter stitch, because with that, you're turning the work and then you lift the next stitch over. And so you're pulling the row from below up is how you're actually joining it together. So in this particular one here, this is Cherry Po. and it goes from side to side, the ball. And you've got short rows here and here. And so what the short rows are actually doing in this particular case is they're shaping the entire ball, and you're creating a three-dimensional effect with short rows. And if you turn to the side here, the short rows are almost invisible, because with garter stitch, it's going to be, particularly in cases where it's visible from both sides, it can be, it's very easy to hide the short rows with the German method.
Is there any place that you wouldn't use German short rows?
German short rows, I find when you've got something that's got a very loose stitch pattern, it's not ideal, because you're trying to rely on pulling the row below up in order to actually hide where it's turned. So if the stitch pattern is loose, like in a shawl or something like that, then you're going to run into the problem of it's going to be visible and it will leave a hole. So that's the one time that I find that it's not ideal. Generally I find that if something is not working very well for you in a particular situation, and if you've got a range of short row types in your arsenal, swap another one out and try it, is really a good thing to try.
That's definitely true. And that's an interesting point that you made, because it makes me realise why I like German short rows so much, because I tend to like a firmish fabric, and so I haven't had a problem with it so far. But it's interesting to hear you say that it doesn't work so well in a loose gauge.
And the other method that I've actually added in the book is called the yarn over short row method. And it's one that it doesn't get used all that often. And the times that I find it the most useful is for socks. And the reason it's so good in socks is because your yarn over is sitting on the needle. So effectively, it's like your wrap is sitting up on the needle. And with sock heel, you start with the width of the heel and you're working short rows in, and then you're working short rows back out again. So you've got a short row sitting on top of a short row. So if all of them are actually on the needle, it's really easy to just work the two of them together. So it's about the only time I really use the yarn over method, but it's extremely helpful.
Okay, now just to finish this topic, do you have any special tips that you can either give to beginners who are really struggling, or even some advanced things for people who who do short rows all the time but could learn something else?
Well, for newer knitters, I would definitely suggest learning several different methods. And so that way you know which ones that you like best, and you know which situations you like them in. And I suppose an extension of that is then for more advanced knitters is don't be afraid to swap short rows out. So if you've got a pattern that calls for wrap and turn, but you know that you don't really like that, just swap it out for a method that you do like, that you know will work better in that particular situation. And I suppose tied with that as well is when you do swap them out, be aware of how it will alter the pattern. So if it says to work before, 3 stitches before the previously wrapped stitch, just be aware how changing the method might change the location of that as well.
That's super important. That's something you really need to know for sure. Let's change the topic completely and go to photography, which is really important for any independent designer. Now, your husband is your photographer, so can you say something about your approach to photography and photo shoots that maybe is a bit helpful for other independent designers or makers?
My husband does all the photography, as you said, Joseph. He does the photography for me, and so he's kind of been learning along with me, really, because it started, it's a hobby for him, and he really enjoys doing the photographs. I find that, well, obviously you need to start with some good equipment. That's always a good place to start. And most designers, if you're doing it with another job or in the evenings and things like that, having it with your partner can be extremely helpful, because it means you can take advantage of very short spaces of time that you might have, or if the weather changes.
Exactly.
Yeah, or if the weather changes and you suddenly realize that you've got perfect cloud cover, you can go and take a very quick photo shoot. So it's got huge advantages to be able to take advantage basically of good situations. We sometimes do work with other models, but it tends to be for books, so that we've got several samples all done at the same time, and then it's worth your while. Because if you've just got one piece, or you're not really going to hire another a model to do it. So which is why I end up doing a lot of my own modeling, is just because it's fast and it's quick and it fits in with their life.
And for so many small businesses where partners or couples or friends who live close together or working together are totally reliant on being able to quickly work together in unusual time frames. Could be the weekend, could be the evenings, because that's all you've got really. And you have to fit, there's always so much to do. And so you have to fit in what you can in those little time slots. So I can totally relate to that. Let's talk now about your knit-alongs. Knit-alongs seem to be really important to you because you're quite, you're very active on the forums there, and which is a good thing because it means that you immediately get feedback on your patterns. So how has this direct contact with knitters influenced or impacted your pattern writing and designing?
Yeah, the knit-alongs all ended up kind of coming about by accident for me, really, because the first one, because I like designing garments, I said, if I do a knit-along, I want it to be a garment design. But of course, for garments, what ends up causing problems for people is modifications, is that we don't all come in the same size. And as a designer, I've got to use just your standard sizing as a starting point, because you have to put something in the pattern. So in order for it to fit all the knitters, what became important to me was making sure people knew how to modify patterns and where to modify them. And that's really where the knit-alongs came in. So I release each section of the pattern as a series of clues with a page of tips and kind of explaining how you would change things, where you would change it. And because the pattern is, like, the clue is just a section of the pattern, and it means that more advanced or experienced knitters, instead of taking the pattern and running and finishing through, they're waiting around and they're chatting with other knitters and they're giving them advice. And so while obviously there's my input, it's way more than me. It ends up becoming a community, and all of the other knitters actually support the newer knitters and the newer garment knitters. So you end up with a very inclusive teaching experience for everyone.
That's a really smart way of organising it.
And it means that my patterns end up including a lot more of those modifications and things that are going to trip people up as they're knitting, so that it means that I know where people are going to have problems.
Okay, we're going to finish off the interview now, and we'll do that with a concluding question, and that's, you've been in the industry now for 12 years, which is quite a long time, and it's very a successful thing to do is to keep your business full-time throughout that long time span. And you've done that in a few different ways. You've brought out your yarn, you've been publishing books, you've been teaching regularly in workshops and retreats everywhere. So when you look back on all the things that you've done over those years, what do you think you're most content with? And also, is there any area in your knitting or your designing or your business that you feel really compelled to explore further that you haven't quite done yet?
I think what I'm probably most content with is the fact that it's been completely unpredictable. Is that while I started off accidentally designing and putting PDFs together, everything led onto another thing organically. So what I've kind of come to discover is that you can't really predict what you're going to be doing in 6 weeks, 6 months, or whatever time. So that actually kind of leads on to what I hope for the future as well, is I hope it continues to be as unpredictable as it has been up to this point, and that I've got enough flexibility that I can actually keep changing and exploring new things and being able to take advantage of opportunities as they present themselves.
Yeah, that is so important to still keep a strong interest after 12 years, isn't it? You do need that flexibility and that natural organic change into developing different areas. So that's a really good answer, yeah. Well, it's been fantastic to have you on Fruity Knitting. Thanks so much for spending your time and sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. It was lovely talking with you.
Good. Okay, let's say goodbye to the audience. Bye.
Bye.